There are actors who use beauty as their instrument, who rely on the audience's willingness to follow a face that pleases them into whatever emotional territory the story requires. And there are actors who use something else, who understand that the instrument is not the face, but what lives behind it, the intelligence, the suffering, the specific accumulated weight of a life that has been examined rather than merely lived, and who offer this interior reality to the camera with a completeness and a courage that beautiful faces rarely need and often cannot access. Charles Laughton was the second kind. He was also, which complicated everything, a man who despised his own face, who looked in the mirror and saw the porcine, heavy-jowled, physically unprepossessing exterior that the world also saw, and who experienced this seeing as a form of ongoing violence rather than the neutral fact it might have been to a man with a different relationship to his own appearance. The self-hatred was real and was profound, and was the psychological engine behind a creative drive so fierce and so unrelenting that it produced some of the most extraordinary performances in the history of cinema. Charles Laughton was born on July 1st, 1899, in Scarborough, Yorkshire, England, the son of a hotel keeper who had no particular interest in the arts, and who produced, somehow, a child for whom the arts were the only comprehensible way of being in the world. He was fat as a child and fat as an adult, and conscious of it every moment, in the way of people who have been unkind to about their bodies since early childhood, and who carry the unkindness as a permanent internal weather. He found, in performance, the thing that the body was not, a space in which the specific dimensions of the face and the flesh were not the point, in which what mattered was what he could do with the instrument, rather than what the instrument looked like at rest. He trained at RADA, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, with the seriousness of someone for whom the training was not preparation, but salvation, and he arrived on the London stage in the mid-1920s with a technique and a range that the profession recognized immediately as something unusual. He could do everything, not the generalist's version of everything, where the range is wide but thin, the version where the range is wide, and each point on it is occupied with full, specific, committed depth. Comedy and tragedy and menace and pathos, and the specific, disturbing quality of a man whose psychological complexity exceeded what the available categories could contain. Hollywood found him in the early 1930s, and the films of his first American decade are a catalog of transformations that still astonish. The Private Life of Henry VIII in 1933 gave him the role that won him the Academy Award, a Henry who was lusty and comic and terrifying by turns, whose appetites were enormous and whose capacity for genuine feeling existed uncomfortably alongside his capacity for cruelty, played with a physical abandon that suggested Laughton had decided the role required everything he had and had given it accordingly. He won the Oscar. He was the first British actor to do so. He did not appear to believe it. The belief problem was structural and permanent. He was one of the most gifted performers alive, and he knew it in the intellectual sense. He could assess his own work with the accuracy of a trained critic, could recognize when a performance had achieved what he had been reaching for, and he simultaneously, at the level of felt experience, could not receive the recognition that the achievement deserved. The self-doubt was not modesty. It was a genuine inability to feel what the evidence clearly demonstrated, that the man looking back from the mirror was one of the most extraordinary artists of the 20th century. He wore 50 pounds of rubber hump for The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1939, and he endured the hours of painful makeup and the physical restriction of the prosthetics and the heat of the California lights with the specific, driven patience of a man who understood that the discomfort was the point, that Quasimodo's suffering had to begin with Laughton's suffering, that the audience's sympathy for the character required the actor to have earned it through physical reality rather than simulation. The performance is heartbreaking in the way that only performances of genuine conviction are heartbreaking. Not because the makeup is effective, though it is, but because behind the makeup is a man who understood what it meant to inhabit a body the world found repellent, and who played the understanding with the authority of experience. Captain Bligh in Mutiny on the Bounty in 1935 was the other pole. The tyrant, the man whose authority was absolute and whose exercise of it was merciless, played with a psychological precision that refused the easy reading of the villain as simply evil. Bligh was not simply evil. He was a man whose competence was real and whose cruelty was also real, and the combination, the authority that was genuinely earned coexisting with the humanity that was genuinely denied, was more disturbing than simple villainy and more interesting than simple heroism. Laughton played the disturbance without resolving it, because the unresolved version was the true version. The Night of the Hunter in 1955 was his only film as a director, and it is one of the strangest and most beautiful films in the American cinema. He had spent 30 years absorbing the craft from in front of the camera, watching directors work and understanding the language of film with the thoroughness of a student who never stopped studying. When he finally directed, the result was not a first film. It was the work of a man who had been thinking about visual storytelling for decades and who had, in Robert Mitchum's Preacher, with love and hate tattooed on his knuckles, and 2 orphaned children in a boat on a moonlit river, found exactly the right material for everything he had been accumulating. The film failed commercially on its release. Critics were confused. Audiences stayed away. Laughton, whose self-doubt needed no additional evidence for its prosecution, received the failure as confirmation of what he had always feared. He never directed again. The Night of the Hunter was recognized, in the decades after its failure, as a masterpiece, as one of the most visually and thematically original American films ever made, a fairy tale and a nightmare simultaneously, a film that could only have been made by someone who understood both the surface of cinema and what lay beneath it. Laughton did not live to receive this recognition fully. He died on December 15, 1962, of spinal cancer at the age of 63. He had been, in the final years of his life, doing readings, performing literature for live audiences, bringing his voice and his intelligence to the text of the Bible and Shakespeare and the American Constitution with the passion of a man who had found, in the late afternoon of his career, a form that required nothing of the body that the body could not provide. The audiences for these readings were, by all accounts, transformed by them. The man who hated his own reflection gave them something that had nothing to do with reflection, the pure sound of a great intelligence in full engagement with the greatest writing in the English language. He was plagued by self-doubt. He was a visionary. He was a man whose talent was so large and whose self-acceptance was so small that the gap between them was the space in which everything he created lived. The world fell in love with the talent. He never quite managed to follow.